In the summer of 1942, when the Pacific sun beat down mercilessly on the newly conquered territories, a group of Japanese military engineers gathered around a peculiar trophy in a makeshift workshop outside Manila. The vehicle before them appeared almost comically primitive, a boxy utilitarian conveyance that seemed to mock everything they understood about automotive engineering. This was their first real encounter with the American Willys MB, what the enemy soldiers casually called a Jeep, and the initial assessment was unanimous and damning. The chief engineer, Tanaka Hiroaki, a graduate of Tokyo Imperial University who had spent 5 years studying metallurgy and mechanical design in Germany before the war, circled the captured vehicle with undisguised contempt etched across his weathered features. The Jeep had been abandoned by retreating American forces near Bataan, left behind in the chaotic exodus that saw thousands of soldiers disappearing into the jungle or surrendering to the advancing Imperial Army. Someone had attempted to destroy it, but the demolition had been hasty and incomplete. The engine block bore hammer marks, and someone had poured sand into the oil reservoir, yet here it sat, somehow still operational after Japanese mechanics had spent merely 3 hours cleaning and repairing what they assumed would be catastrophic damage. This resilience should have given them pause, but pride is a patient executioner, and these men were among the finest technical minds the Empire could produce. They had designed aircraft that could outmaneuver anything America put in the sky. They had created naval vessels that combined speed with devastating firepower. Surely this crude box on wheels held no mysteries beyond their comprehension. Tanaka's assistant, Lieutenant Watanabe Kenji, carefully documented every specification in a leather-bound notebook that would later be found among the ruins of a burned-out command post in Burma. The measurements seemed almost insulting in their simplicity. Wheelbase of 80 inches, overall length of 132 inches, width of 62 inches, height to the top of the windshield frame of 52 inches when folded, 71 inches when raised. The engine displaced 134.2 cubic inches, producing a mere 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. 60 horsepower. Watanabe underlined this figure twice, adding a note in the margin that expressed bewilderment at how American industry could produce such an underpowered vehicle in quantities that intelligence reports suggested exceeded 500,000 units. The construction philosophy appeared equally backward to these sophisticated engineers. Where Japanese military vehicles incorporated carefully calculated stress distributions and precisely engineered load-bearing structures, the Jeep seemed cobbled together from flat plates and simple angles. The frame consisted of 2 basic channel rails with minimal crossmembers. The body panels were flat steel stampings that a competent metalworker could reproduce with the most basic tools. The suspension relied on semi-elliptical leaf springs front and rear, a design that European manufacturers had begun abandoning before the First World War in favor of more sophisticated independent suspension systems. Everything about the vehicle screamed obsolescence and crude expedience. Major Ishikawa Saburo, the senior officer overseeing the technical evaluation, arrived at the workshop as afternoon shadows lengthened across the compound. He had commanded armored units in Manchuria and considered himself a connoisseur of military vehicles. His own forces relied on Type 97 trucks and Type 95 light tanks, products of careful Japanese engineering that incorporated lessons learned from European designs. When he examined the Jeep, his expression shifted from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. The steering mechanism was absurdly direct, lacking the sophisticated gearing that smoothed control inputs in proper military vehicles. The 4-wheel drive system employed a simple transfer case with a mechanical linkage that seemed primitive compared to the German all-wheel drive systems he had studied. The entire powertrain could be disassembled and understood by a moderately skilled mechanic in a single afternoon. What particularly amused the gathered engineers was the apparent lack of specialization. Japanese military doctrine emphasized purpose-built vehicles for specific roles. Reconnaissance units received light, fast vehicles. Supply operations relied on heavier trucks with substantial cargo capacity. Command staff traveled in vehicles that provided protection and communication capabilities. The Americans, it seemed, had simply built one basic vehicle and expected it to perform every conceivable role. This lack of sophistication struck the Japanese engineers as evidence of industrial might overwhelming intelligent design. America was rich enough to waste resources on universal mediocrity rather than specialized excellence. The testing began the following morning, conducted on the relatively smooth roads around the captured airfield. A corporal who had learned to drive on civilian vehicles before the war took the wheel, and the Jeep performed exactly as expected, adequately but unimpressively. It accelerated slowly, topped out at approximately 65 miles per hour on flat ground, and handled with all the grace of a farmer's work cart. The ride quality was atrocious, every imperfection in. The road surface transmitted directly through the primitive suspension to the passengers' spines. After an hour of driving, the test operator complained of fatigue and discomfort. Watanabe recorded these observations with clinical precision, noting that Japanese Type 95 reconnaissance cars provided superior comfort and comparable speed while offering better protection for their crews. The engineers photographed every component, created detailed sketches of the drivetrain layout, and collected samples of materials for metallurgical analysis. The steel used in the frame showed adequate strength but nothing exceptional. The aluminum engine block represented a concession to weight reduction, but sacrificed the durability that cast iron provided. Every choice seemed to prioritize ease of manufacturing over engineering excellence. Tanaka drafted a preliminary report that evening, summarizing the Jeep as a testament to American industrial capacity rather than design sophistication. The vehicle could be produced quickly and in enormous quantities, he concluded, but represented no technical advancement that Japanese industry needed to emulate or fear. The captured Jeep sat in the workshop for another week, occasionally started and driven short distances around the compound. Some junior mechanics expressed grudging admiration for how easily the vehicle could be maintained. Parts were interchangeable without filing or fitting. The engine could be removed and reinstalled by 4 men in under 2 hours without specialized equipment. The electrical system was so simple that troubleshooting rarely required more than a visual inspection. These observations were noted but dismissed as irrelevant curiosities. Ease of maintenance meant nothing if the vehicle lacked capability. By mid-August of 1942, Tanaka had completed his comprehensive analysis. The document ran to 47 pages and included detailed technical drawings, metallurgical reports, and comparative assessments against Japanese and German equivalents. His conclusion reflected the consensus view among the engineering staff. The Willys MB represented American automotive production philosophy at its most basic level: simple, crude, and utterly dependent on overwhelming industrial capacity to compensate for design inadequacies. Japanese forces would encounter these vehicles throughout the Pacific Theater, but they posed no technical challenge and certainly no threat to Japan's carefully engineered military vehicles. The report was filed, copies were distributed to relevant commands, and the captured Jeep was assigned to light duty around the base. Nobody considered that this vehicle, which had survived an attempted destruction and required only minimal repair to return to service, might be trying to tell them something. Nobody wondered whether simplicity itself could be a sophisticated engineering choice rather than a limitation. Nobody yet understood that they were staring at a philosophy of design that would prove far more durable than their own elaborate creations. The rainy season was approaching, and with it would come lessons written in mud and suffering. But for now, in the dry heat of late summer, the Japanese engineers felt confident in their assessment. They had examined the enemy's mechanical achievement and found it wanting. They had laughed at its simplicity. They had documented its inadequacies. They had utterly failed to understand what they were seeing. The first typhoon of the season arrived 3 weeks later, transforming the landscape into a liquid nightmare where the real education would begin. The monsoon rains of 1942 arrived with biblical intensity, turning every road in the Philippines into a river of mud that swallowed vehicles and drowned ambitions. By the second week of September, conventional military operations had ground to a virtual halt across much of the archipelago as Japanese forces discovered that their carefully planned logistics networks simply ceased to function when the sky opened up. Supply convoys that normally completed their routes in 4 hours found themselves immobilized for days, their vehicles buried to the axles in bottomless muck that no amount of winching or pushing could overcome. This was when the captured Jeep, that primitive American contraption that had inspired such derision, began to reveal capabilities that shook the foundational assumptions of every engineer who had examined it. The transformation of understanding began with necessity rather than curiosity. Major Ishikawa needed to reach an outlying outpost that had reported disease outbreak among the garrison. The regular route, normally a 2-hour drive, had become impassable to standard military vehicles. 3 Type 97 trucks had already become hopelessly stuck attempting the journey, requiring hours of labor by dozens of soldiers to extract them from the mud. Someone suggested trying the captured American vehicle, more as a joke than a serious proposal. The Jeep had been performing light duties around the main base, shuttling small loads and personnel over relatively maintained roads. Nobody expected it to succeed where proper military trucks had failed so completely. Corporal Nakamura Takeshi, who had become the informal custodian of the Jeep through repeated assignment to drive it, received orders to attempt the supply run. He loaded medical supplies and fresh rations into the vehicle's minimal cargo area, engaged the 4-wheel drive system using the simple floor-mounted lever, and headed toward what remained of the road. The route descended from the relatively elevated base compound through a series of rice paddies that had transformed into shallow lakes, then climbed into forested hills where the trail became a churning channel of liquid clay. Nakamura had driven this route before the rains in a Type 97 truck and remembered it as unremarkable. Now, it resembled the approaches to hell. The Jeep entered the first flooded section at moderate speed, and immediately Nakamura understood something the engineers had missed during their dry season evaluation. The vehicle's high ground clearance, which had seemed like wasted vertical space, suddenly became critical. Water surged around the wheels, reaching halfway up the doors, but the engine breathed through an elevated intake and continued running without hesitation. The simple drivetrain, lacking the complex gearing that characterized Japanese military vehicles, transmitted power directly to all 4 wheels with minimal loss. The Jeep wallowed through the flooded paddies like a determined water buffalo, ugly and inelegant but absolutely unstoppable. Beyond the floods came the mud, and here the education intensified. The narrow tires, which engineers had criticized as inadequate for distributing vehicle weight, bit into the slippery surface with unexpected tenacity. The short wheelbase allowed the Jeep to navigate between obstacles that would have trapped longer vehicles. Most remarkably, when one wheel lost traction and began to spin uselessly, the open differential simply transferred power to the other 3 wheels, and the vehicle clawed forward. Nakamura had driven dozens of military vehicles during his service, and none of them behaved like this. They either had traction or they did not. The Jeep seemed to find traction where none should exist. The journey took 6 hours instead of the usual 2, but Nakamura reached the outpost. The soldiers there, who had been isolated for nearly a week with sick comrades and dwindling supplies, greeted his arrival with disbelief bordering on religious fervor. They had watched 3 Japanese trucks fail to complete the same journey over the past 5 days. The American vehicle, that laughable trophy from a defeated enemy, had simply driven through obstacles that had stopped vehicles 3 times its size. Word of this achievement spread through the command structure with the speed of wildfire, reaching Tanaka's engineering office within hours of Nakamura's return. Tanaka's initial response was dismissive. One successful supply run under difficult conditions proved nothing. Variables of route selection, driver skill, and random chance could explain the outcome. But Major Ishikawa, pragmatic above all else, ordered systematic testing. He wanted to understand whether the Jeep's performance represented a genuine capability or merely fortunate accident. Over the following 2 weeks, as the monsoon continued its relentless assault, Nakamura and several other experienced drivers operated the Jeep across every type of terrain that the Philippine landscape offered. They drove through mud that reached the vehicle's floor pans. They forded streams swollen to small rivers. They climbed hillsides so steep and slippery that men on foot struggled to maintain footing. Lieutenant Watanabe accompanied these tests, filling notebook after notebook with observations that increasingly contradicted his earlier conclusions. The Jeep's performance in extreme conditions wasn't just adequate, it was extraordinary. On terrain that completely stopped Japanese Type 97 trucks, the American vehicle maintained forward progress. Where Type 95 reconnaissance cars became helplessly mired, the Jeep simply shifted into low range and climbed out of trouble. The vehicle that had seemed so crude and underpowered during dry season evaluation revealed itself as something approaching mechanical poetry when conditions deteriorated. The engineering team began to comprehend the philosophy they had initially missed. Every design choice that had appeared primitive or inadequate served a specific purpose in extreme environments. The flat plane body panels shed mud and debris that would accumulate in more complex shapes. The high ground clearance that seemed wasteful provided clearance over obstacles that would hang up lower vehicles. The simple leaf spring suspension could flex dramatically without damage, allowing wheels to maintain contact with terrain that would destroy more sophisticated independent suspension systems. The supposedly crude four-wheel drive system with its open differentials distributed power in ways that more advanced limited-slip systems could not match in certain conditions. Most humbling was the realization about maintenance in field conditions. When a Type 97 truck became stuck in deep mud, extraction required hours of work by many men, and the mechanical stress frequently caused damage that demanded skilled repair. The Jeep could often extract itself using its own power, but when it did become truly stuck, recovery was simple because the vehicle weighed only 2,300 pounds. 4 strong men could physically lift one corner to place logs underneath. 6 men could push it free from situations that would trap much heavier vehicles permanently. And when components did fail under extreme stress, repairs could be completed with basic tools by mechanics of moderate skill. Tanaka found himself studying the Jeep with new eyes, seeing patterns he had dismissed during the initial evaluation. The interchangeability of parts that had seemed like manufacturing expedients revealed itself as brilliant field maintenance design. When a front wheel bearing failed during a particularly brutal supply run, Nakamura simply swapped it with a rear bearing using a wrench and a hammer. The repair took 20 minutes. An equivalent failure on a Japanese vehicle would have required specialized tools and several hours of work by a trained mechanic. The simplicity that inspired mockery was actually sophisticated engineering aimed at a completely different set of priorities than those that governed Japanese military vehicle design. By late September of 1942, the captured Jeep had become the most reliable logistics asset in the entire sector. While Japanese trucks sat immobilized waiting for roads to dry or for recovery teams to extract them from mud, the American vehicle completed supply runs with mechanical regularity. Soldiers began requesting the Jeep specifically for difficult missions. Officers who had initially joked about the crude American trophy now competed for access to it. The vehicle had driven through conditions that qualified as genuinely hellish, conditions that represented the absolute worst environment military vehicles could encounter short of direct combat damage, and it had performed not just adequately but spectacularly. The implications troubled Tanaka deeply. His entire career had been built on the assumption that sophisticated engineering produced superior results. German technical excellence represented the gold standard toward which Japan aspired. Yet here was evidence that a completely different approach, one that prioritized simplicity and durability over technical sophistication, might actually be superior in the conditions where wars were actually fought. The Americans hadn't built a crude vehicle because they lacked skill. They had built exactly the vehicle they needed, and they had done it so well that its capabilities weren't even apparent until those capabilities were tested to destruction. The monsoon continued through October, and the Jeep continued to perform. It became a fixture of impossible missions, the vehicle that went where nothing else could go. Nakamura drove it through floods that reached the bottom of the windshield frame. He climbed slopes so steep that passengers had to lean forward to prevent the vehicle from tipping over backward. He forded rivers where the current pushed the lightweight vehicle sideways, requiring careful angle selection to prevent being swept downstream. And through all of this mechanical abuse, the Jeep simply continued functioning, requiring nothing more than basic maintenance that could be performed with the toolkit that came bolted under the driver's seat. The engineers who had laughed at the Jeep's simplicity in August stopped laughing by November. They had witnessed something that contradicted everything their education had taught them about engineering excellence. They had seen crude simplicity outperform sophisticated complexity in the only test that ultimately mattered: actual field performance under the worst possible conditions. The vehicle had driven through hell, and it had come back asking for more work. In the war room of the captured American headquarters building, where maps covered walls and the smell of mildew competed with cigarette smoke, a gathering took place that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Major Ishikawa had assembled his senior staff, including Tanaka and the engineering team, to discuss what military intelligence delicately termed equipment performance discrepancies. The captured Jeep sat outside, covered in dried mud from its latest supply run, visible through the tall windows as a silent witness to the discussion inside. What was about to unfold represented something rare in military culture: a frank admission that initial assessments had been catastrophically wrong. Tanaka stood before a chalkboard where he had sketched the basic mechanical layout of the Willys MB. His presentation bore little resemblance to the confident dismissal he had delivered in August. Now, in late November of 1942, after 3 months of watching the American vehicle operate under conditions that destroyed or immobilized Japanese equipment, his tone carried the weight of unwelcome revelation. He began by acknowledging what everyone in the room already knew from daily operations: the Jeep had become indispensable to their logistics network. Without it, several outlying positions would have been abandoned, certain supply lines would have collapsed, and medical evacuations that saved lives would not have occurred. The mockery had begun, Tanaka explained, from a position of cultural and technical arrogance. Japanese engineering philosophy, heavily influenced by German technical traditions, emphasized optimization through complexity. A well-designed machine, according to this worldview, incorporated sophisticated solutions to engineering challenges. Superior materials, precisely calculated stress distributions, carefully calibrated systems that worked in harmony, these were the hallmarks of excellence. The Jeep violated every principle this philosophy held sacred, and the initial reaction had been to dismiss it as primitive American brute force manufacturing. Lieutenant Watanabe distributed copies of a comparative analysis he had prepared. The document listed 15 specific features of the Jeep that the engineering team had initially criticized, alongside observations of how each feature performed under field conditions. The list read like a systematic dismantling of conventional wisdom. The simple ladder frame that seemed structurally inadequate actually provided exceptional rigidity while allowing enough flex to prevent catastrophic failure when the vehicle encountered extreme terrain. The flat body panels that appeared crude actually shed mud and debris while being easily repairable in field conditions. The unsophisticated leaf spring suspension that seemed obsolete actually allowed individual wheels to articulate over obstacles without breaking. Captain Matsumoto, who commanded supply operations for the sector, provided tactical context that drove home the strategic implications. In August, before the monsoon, Japanese forces had operated 73 Type 97 trucks across the region. These vehicles handled routine supply runs adequately during dry season. When the rains came, operational availability collapsed to less than 30%. Trucks became stuck, broke down under the stress of mud operations, or simply could not complete routes through flooded or deteriorated roads. The single captured Jeep, during the same period, completed 97% of its assigned missions. One vehicle, designed by engineers the Japanese military had dismissed as unsophisticated, was providing more reliable logistics support than dozens of supposedly superior trucks. The maintenance data proved equally embarrassing. Type 97 trucks required an average of 4 hours of mechanic time per week to maintain operational readiness under monsoon conditions. The Jeep required less than 1 hour. When Japanese trucks broke down in the field, recovery and repair often took multiple days and required specialized tools and trained mechanics. The Jeep's failures, which were remarkably rare, could usually be repaired on site with basic tools by drivers of moderate skill. The American vehicle wasn't just more capable, it was dramatically more maintainable, and maintainability directly translated to availability. Major Ishikawa invited discussion, and what followed was remarkable for its honesty. Officers who had initially joked about the crude American vehicle now competed to share stories of its capabilities. One described watching the Jeep drive through a stream crossing that had trapped a Type 97 truck for 2 days. Another recounted a medical evacuation where the Jeep had climbed a muddy hillside that no other vehicle in the sector could have managed. A third. The Americans had made different choices. They had deliberately sacrificed performance characteristics that mattered on paper, top speed, ride comfort, load capacity, protection, to maximize characteristics that mattered in actual combat operations: reliability, maintainability, fuel efficiency, and capability in extreme terrain. This wasn't the result of inferior engineering skill. It was the result of a completely different design philosophy, one that prioritized operational availability over theoretical capability. Lieutenant Watanabe raised a question that had clearly been troubling him. If American industry could produce hundreds of thousands of vehicles with these capabilities, what did that imply about American military potential? Japanese intelligence had consistently dismissed American manufacturing as quantitatively impressive, but qualitatively inferior to German or Japanese production. The Jeep suggested that assessment might be dangerously wrong. The Americans weren't producing inferior copies of European designs. They were developing their own solutions optimized for different priorities, and those solutions worked remarkably well. The discussion turned to whether Japanese industry could replicate the Jeep's capabilities. Tanaka's assessment was pessimistic. The vehicle's apparent simplicity was deceptive. Japanese manufacturers could certainly copy the physical design. The basic layout was not complex, but replicating the engineering philosophy required cultural changes in how designers approached problems. Japanese engineering culture rewarded sophistication and technical complexity. The Jeep succeeded precisely because its designers had resisted the temptation toward complexity, maintaining brutal simplicity even when more sophisticated solutions were available. Moreover, the Jeep's design reflected the industrial context of its creation. American manufacturers had experience with mass production on scales Japanese industry had never attempted. The Willys MB was designed from the beginning for production rates of tens of thousands of units per month. Every component was optimized for manufacturability using mass production techniques. Japanese military vehicles were essentially craft-built in comparison, each unit receiving significant individual attention during assembly. The Americans had achieved standardization and interchangeability that Japanese industry simply could not match with current capabilities. Major Ishikawa summarized the strategic implications with characteristic bluntness. Japanese forces were encountering increasing numbers of Jeeps throughout the Pacific theater. Intelligence reports suggested American production exceeded 50,000 units per month and was still increasing. These vehicles were appearing everywhere American forces operated, performing roles from reconnaissance to command transport to artillery towing to ambulance service. The standard Japanese response had been to dismiss them as crude but numerous. After 3 months of operating a captured example, that dismissal appeared to be dangerous self-delusion. The meeting concluded with orders to prepare a comprehensive report for higher command. The document would detail every observation about the Jeep's capabilities, include frank assessment of Japanese vehicle inadequacies in similar conditions, and recommend significant changes to vehicle design philosophy. Tanaka knew such a report would be unpopular. Military bureaucracies resist admissions of error, and this document would essentially state that years of vehicle development had been based on flawed assumptions. The engineers who had laughed at the Jeep's simplicity in August would now have to explain to their superiors why that laughter had been premature. Outside, rain resumed falling as afternoon faded toward evening. The captured Jeep sat where Nakamura had parked it, ready for its next assignment. By morning, it would be out again, driving through conditions that kept better-designed vehicles immobilized. The Japanese engineers had stopped laughing, but stopping laughing was not the same as truly understanding. That deeper comprehension would require experiences even more extreme than monsoon logistics, lessons that would be written in smoke and blood across islands whose names would become synonymous with hell itself. The island of Guadalcanal entered Japanese consciousness in August of 1942, as a strategic necessity and would leave it as a graveyard of assumptions. By December of that same year, as the campaign devolved into a grinding attritional nightmare, Japanese forces found themselves facing not just American firepower, but American logistics, and it was in logistics that the true nature of modern warfare revealed itself with pitiless clarity. The Jeep, that vehicle which had inspired mockery in Manila workshops, was everywhere on Guadalcanal, performing tasks that Japanese commanders had not imagined possible for such a small, simple machine. What made the situation particularly galling was that Japanese forces were capturing these vehicles with some regularity during small-scale engagements, and each capture provided another opportunity to witness capabilities that contradicted everything their doctrine taught about military transportation. Colonel Yamada Takeshi commanded a regiment that had been fighting on Guadalcanal since October, and by late December his force was in desperate condition. Supply lines from the coast to forward positions had collapsed under constant American pressure. Japanese trucks, when they could be gotten ashore at all, struggled with the island's combination of steep volcanic terrain, dense jungle, and bottomless mud. Many had been destroyed by air attack or artillery fire. Others had simply broken down under conditions that exceeded their design parameters. The regiment's transportation capacity had deteriorated to the point where supplies were being man-carried along jungle trails, a process so slow and inefficient that frontline units were literally starving while adequate food sat in coastal dumps. In this context, the capture of 3 American Jeeps during a night raid on a forward supply point represented a windfall that might determine whether Yamada's regiment could continue functioning. The raid itself had been a modest success. His troops had overrun a lightly defended American logistics site, killed or captured the handful of soldiers present, and seized medical supplies, ammunition, and the 3 vehicles. The Jeeps were undamaged and fully fueled, and Yamada immediately assigned them to critical supply runs that Japanese trucks could no longer complete. What happened over the following weeks would force a complete re-evaluation of what logistics vehicles could accomplish under combat conditions. The route from Yamada's coastal supply point to his forward positions climbed approximately 800 vertical feet over a distance of roughly 6 miles. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through primary jungle so dense that sunlight barely penetrated, across streams that ran swift and cold from the island's interior mountains, and up slopes so steep that men climbed using roots and tree trunks as handholds. Before the supply situation became critical, Japanese soldiers had made this journey carrying 50-pound loads, requiring 6 to 8 hours for the upward trek, as malnutrition weakened the troops. The time increased and the loads decreased. By December, the human supply line was failing. Japanese Type 97 trucks could not even attempt this route. The trail was too narrow, too steep, and too obstructed by vegetation and fallen trees. Yamada had engineers trying to improve the route, but doing so under constant threat of American artillery and air attack made progress agonizingly slow. The captured Jeeps, however, simply drove the route as it existed. The narrow wheelbase allowed them to navigate between trees that would have trapped wider vehicles. The short overall length meant they could make tight switchbacks that longer trucks could not manage. The high ground clearance let them straddle fallen logs and large rocks that would have hung up vehicles with less clearance. Sergeant Ishida Kenji, a veteran driver who had operated everything from motorcycles to medium trucks during his military service, was assigned to one of the captured Jeeps. His first attempt at the supply run began at dawn on December 23, 1942, and immediately presented challenges that he believed would prove insurmountable. The trail climbed away from the coast at an angle that seemed impossible for a vehicle to maintain traction. Ishida engaged the 4-wheel drive system, shifted into the lowest available gear, and simply pointed the Jeep at the slope. The vehicle clawed upward, engines screaming at high revolutions, all 4 tires churning through mud and leaf litter. Where Japanese trucks would have spun helplessly and slid backward, the Jeep maintained forward progress through sheer mechanical determination. The jungle section proved even more challenging. The trail frequently disappeared entirely, becoming merely a slightly less dense corridor through vegetation that scraped along both sides of the vehicle. Low-hanging branches threatened to decapitate anyone sitting upright, forcing Ishida and his passenger to crouch behind the folded windshield. The Jeep's flat surfaces shed this vegetation as the vehicle pushed through, while more complex body shapes would have snagged and become entangled. Twice, Ishida had to stop and use a machete to clear fallen branches that completely blocked the trail. These delays took minutes rather than hours because the Jeep could simply resume moving once the immediate obstacle was removed. The stream crossings tested capabilities that Ishida had not believed possible. The watercourses running down from Guadalcanal's interior were swift and cold, flowing over rocky beds that provided treacherous footing. The Jeep forded 3 such streams, water rising past the wheel hubs and surging around the vehicle's body. The high-mounted engine intake kept the motor breathing even when water reached the bottom of the doors. The direct-drive 4-wheel system provided enough torque at low speed to maintain momentum against the current. Ishida felt the vehicle being pushed sideways by the water's force, but careful steering maintained enough forward progress to reach the opposite bank. The most terrifying section came where the trail climbed an exposed ridge that offered no cover from American observation. Ishida made this transit at maximum speed, the loaded Jeep bouncing violently over ruts and rocks while he fought to maintain control. Artillery fire began falling behind them, American gunners adjusting range as they tried to bracket the rapidly moving target. The Jeep's small size and speed proved to be survival characteristics. The vehicle was difficult to hit and crossed the exposed section in less than 2 minutes. A larger, slower truck would have been destroyed with certainty. The entire journey from coast to forward positions took 97 minutes. Ishida arrived with approximately 600 pounds of supplies, including medical materials that would save lives and ammunition that would enable defensive operations. The soldiers at the forward position, who had been expecting another backbreaking carry operation, stared at the mud-covered Jeep with the same disbelief that had greeted Corporal Nakamura's arrival at that isolated Philippine outpost months earlier. An American vehicle was keeping Japanese troops supplied because Japanese vehicles could not perform the same mission. Over the following week, the 3 captured Jeeps ran the supply route with mechanical regularity. Each made at least 2 round trips per day, sometimes 3 when urgency demanded and daylight permitted. They carried food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, and occasionally wounded soldiers being evacuated to the coast. The vehicles operated under conditions that would have destroyed more sophisticated equipment: constant moisture that promoted rust and electrical failures, mud that infiltrated every moving part, mechanical shocks from rough terrain that would have shaken apart less robustly constructed vehicles. Maintenance became a revealing education in design philosophy. The Jeeps broke down, certainly. No vehicle could sustain such abuse without mechanical failures. But the nature of these failures and the ease of repair proved extraordinary. When a front spring shackle failed due to metal fatigue, Ishida fabricated a replacement from scrap metal and bolted it in place using tools from the vehicle's kit. The repair took less than an hour. When an electrical short killed the starter motor, he simply hand-cranked the engine using the starting handle that was part of the vehicle's standard equipment. These expedient repairs, performed by a skilled mechanic, but one with no specialized training on American vehicles, kept the Jeeps operational when similar damage to Japanese vehicles would have required evacuation to a proper workshop. Colonel Yamada filed reports about the captured vehicle's performance, but these documents disappeared into a military bureaucracy increasingly overwhelmed by catastrophic news from multiple fronts. Guadalcanal was being lost, and the loss of an entire campaign somewhat overshadowed observations about enemy logistics vehicles. Yet for the soldiers who depended on those 3 Jeeps for survival, the vehicle's significance approached the mystical. They represented capabilities that Japanese industry had not provided to its own troops. They demonstrated that American engineering, far from being the crude and unsophisticated work product that propaganda suggested, was actually producing equipment superbly optimized for the actual conditions of Pacific warfare. The end came for all 3 vehicles in mid-January of 1943 during the final Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal. Rather than allow them to be recaptured, Japanese engineers attempted to destroy them thoroughly. They removed critical components, poured sand into the engines, and set the vehicles ablaze. American forces recovered the burned hulks 2 days later, and the remarkable thing was that 2 of the 3 were back in operation within 48 hours. Marine mechanics cleaned the engines, replaced destroyed electrical components and fuel lines, and the Jeeps simply started running again. They had been captured, operated under abusive conditions for 3 weeks, deliberately sabotaged, burned, and they still returned to service with minimal repair. The soldiers who had driven those jeeps during their brief time in Japanese service carried memories of the experience to other islands and other battles. Sergeant Ishida survived Guadalcanal and fought on New Georgia, where he again encountered jeeps, now exclusively in American hands, performing logistics miracles that Japanese trucks could not match. He watched American forces supplied with comfortable regularity while Japanese troops went hungry. He saw American wounded evacuated quickly in jeep ambulances, while Japanese wounded died for lack of transportation. The vehicle that had once inspired laughter was now demonstrating the yawning gap between American and Japanese logistics capabilities. The lessons of Guadalcanal spread through the Japanese military slowly and incompletely. Individual officers and soldiers understood what they had witnessed, but institutional learning required acknowledgement of failure, and failure at that scale was difficult for any military organization to process. The captured jeeps had performed better than Japanese vehicles. American logistics worked better than Japanese logistics. American industrial design philosophy produced better results under combat conditions than Japanese philosophy. These were uncomfortable truths, made more uncomfortable by the fact that Japan was losing the war, in part because of these exact inadequacies. The engineers who had laughed at the Jeep's simplicity in August of 1942 were, by January of 1943, no longer laughing at all.